as we look at our first reading from selected verses from Matthew chapter 27. Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus killed. The governor again said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" All of them said, "Let him be crucified." Then he asked, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." So when Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather than a riot was beginning, he took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." Then the people as a whole answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." So he released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. And when they had crucified him, they divided his clothes among themselves by casting lots. Then Jesus cried again with a loud voice and breathed his last. And at that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks were split. The tombs were also opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And when it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who was also a disciple of Jesus. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus, and then Pilate ordered it to be given to him. So Joseph took the body, wrapped in a clean linen cloth, and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn in the rock, and then rolled a great stone to the door of the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were there, sitting opposite the tomb. Our second reading is taken from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 17 and 18, and verse 25. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to proclaim the gospel, and not with eloquent wisdom, so that the cross of Christ might not be emptied of its power. For the message about the cross is foolishness for those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength.
As we continue our series in the Apostles' Creed this week, I am fascinated by this portion of the Creed. And I'm fascinated for a number of reasons. But one of the things that I think about the most with this part of the Creed is there were a lot of well-known people who followed Jesus. There were a lot of well-known disciples and others that we read about in Scripture that followed Jesus. But the only person named in the creed is Pontius Pilate. I think that says something strange about us Christians. That we would put in our creed the guy, the representative of the state, who had the power to keep Jesus from the cross, and like many politicians, folded like a house of cards when the people told him what they wanted to do. It'd be interesting, politicians today that did that, huh? Different sermon. But I do say that this part of the creed is also one of those areas that I'm not sure that I really want to deal with a lot, because it talks about the death of Jesus. It talks about how Jesus, it refers to Jesus' trial, which was a sham. It points to Jesus' death, and it's just like, why would we want to focus on that? And one of the great riddles that I have, and you're going to hear more about this during Lent, but one of the major riddles, one of the questions I have, and it actually was first put to me by one of my favorite professor at seminary, a mentor, not just a professor, to Mike and I, the late, great Don Boyd. You've heard me talk about him before. And Boyd said, when it comes to planning Easter Sunday worship, don't forget Thursday and Friday, because without Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday, what are you celebrating Easter Sunday? And I'll never forget the day that he said that. I feel sorry for those who show up on Palm Sunday, then again on Easter Sunday, without being here Maundy, Thursday, and Good Friday. Because it is about, without Christ's death, without his suffering, there is no resurrection, there is no Easter joy. And however distasteful we might find it, it is crucial to our faith. And there's so many readings. We could have read the entirety of Matthew 27. But you look at the back and forth between Pilate and the crowd. And you look at how Pilate's going back and forth. And Pilate says, what should I do with Jesus who was called the Messiah? And they said, crucify him. And Pilate, he's asking the question. They're going back and forth. And yet, rather than doing their own dirty work, they had Pilate do it. And I'm reminded of a story. I know some of y'all may think I talk too much football, but basketball's my first love, actually. And I grew up in the 1980s watching the Celtics play the best ball you've ever seen since the 1960s Celtics. And I love the retrospectives and the stories that are told. And one of Larry Bird's teammate, Larry Bird's my man. I love Larry Bird. Still have an ornament of his that goes on my Christmas tree every year. Not kidding, okay? I love Larry Bird. And during one of these documentaries, one of Bird's teammates, M.L. Carr, told a story. There was one night in Utah when Bird was hot. And to tell you how good this game was, Larry Bird had a triple-double and 9 steals at the end of 3 quarters. He was 1 steal away from a quadruple-double. And as M.L. Carr tells the story, one time Bird's running down the court and he turns to the Utah coach, Frank Layden, and says, Frank, don't you have anybody who can guard me? And according to M.L.'s story, Frank looked up and down the bench, turned back to Bird, said, No, I got nobody. I got nothing. I can't guard Larry. I got nobody on this team that's going to guard Larry Bird. And you know what's, I thought about that story and preparing for this because evil was doing everything it could to stop Jesus. Through everything it had, including the governor of the area. And Pilate oversaw Jesus' crucifixion. And you notice Kramer also read in there that Jesus was flogged. This was not a nice, clean thing. There was an upper room that came out 15 to 20 years ago that I almost threw away rather than handing it out to church members because it had a picture of Jesus on the cross, but there was not a drop of blood on him. And that just is not an accurate picture. Jesus on the cross was an ugly, bloody thing. And even that, evil was more helpless around Jesus than Frank Layden was trying to stop Larry Bird one night in Utah. Couldn't stop him. And the reason why we mention Pilate in our creed is a reminder that Pilate shows us why we must not obsess with temporal power. We must not obsess with temporal power. That's why you've heard me say before, and you will hear me say again, be passionate, be involved, but do not be consumed by electoral politics of any level. Because the powers of this world are impotent in the face of Jesus. And evil wants church people to get obsessed about what's going on. Because when you are obsessed with the temporal affairs of the world, you are not obsessed with the saving work of Jesus Christ on the cross. Like I said, be involved. Be passionate, but have perspective. Because after all, Pilate shows us why we must not obsess with temporal power. Because at the end of the day, the temporal affairs of this world have no power over the work of the kingdom of Jesus Christ. And you know, we keep reading in here about his death. And we read about how Joseph went and got him at the tomb and put him in the tomb. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there. And that was pretty much it. Or so they thought. We'll get to most of that in next week's installment. But let us also remember the words we heard from Paul this morning. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to proclaim the gospel, and not with eloquent wisdom, so that the cross of Christ might not be emptied of its power. The reason why we have to also look not only at Jesus' suffering under Pontius Pilate, but his death, is that the power of Christ's death cannot be overstated. The power of Christ's death cannot be overstated. Yes, not just the resurrection, not just the power of the resurrection, but the power of Christ's death. Because this was the worst the world could throw at him, and it wasn't enough. They couldn't defeat him. Don't forget, brothers and sisters, that part of the Good Friday narrative, and we could have read through this as well, is what happened when Jesus died. The curtain was torn in two, the ground shook, the sky turned black. All that happened not at the resurrection, but it happened at his death. Because Jesus' death was more powerful than anything else. And that's why when we affirm our belief that Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead, and buried, is so that when we make our basic statement of faith, we don't underestimate the power of Christ's death. And finally, you notice the last thing we had read from Paul's letter, the last thing, for God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. We find hope where others find despair. Christians find hope where others find despair. You notice in that whole death scene, I don't know about you, but somebody I was following that close who had been put to death, I would be heartbroken. I believe I would be heartbroken. I might even be disillusioned and a little bit angry. You told me, Jesus. You told me about your power. And yet, here it is, this lowly, lame little political governor executed you. And yet, we know, as people of faith, that in Christ's death we find hope. Where others found despair, we find hope. Because we are not called to think as the world thinks. But we are called, nay, we are required, as that great hymn, Easter People, Raise Your Voices, reminds us, we are Easter people. We are people who don't buy into all the garbage, all the panic, all the fury. But we realize that we find hope where others find despair. Jesus died, the sermon title says. Jesus died, so, ? In these few moments and these few verses, we have encountered why it is important for us to recall not only Jesus' death, but at whose hand. Not for what it says about those entities individual, but for what it says about who we are and what we believe because of who God is, who Jesus is, and who is the Holy Spirit.